For most of the last 2 centuries, the story of ancient humanity has been told with a quiet confidence that the evidence probably didn't earn. Take the pyramids at Giza. For generations, the working assumption, taught in classrooms, repeated in documentaries, treated as settled, was that they were built by enslaved laborers, whipped into service under a brutal sun. It was a compelling image. It made intuitive sense given what we assumed about ancient power structures. Then archaeologists actually found the workers' village, a place called Hayt al-Ghurab, buried just south of the plateau. What they uncovered wasn't a prison camp. It was a structured settlement with administrative buildings, organized housing, and evidence that the workers were fed high-quality beef at a rate that would have been considered a luxury. The story didn't just get complicated, it got replaced. And the version we'd been confidently repeating for decades turned out to be built almost entirely on assumption. Here's the problem with ancient history as a field. The evidence is almost always incomplete, and incomplete evidence has a way of getting filled in by whatever feels most plausible at the time. We work from what survives: stone, fired clay, bone, and we build frameworks around it that feel robust right up until something new turns up and the whole structure has to be renegotiated. What's changed recently isn't that archaeologists have suddenly gotten better at digging. It's that new technologies are letting them see things the ground was always hiding. LiDAR surveys are revealing entire settlement networks beneath dense vegetation. Laboratory analysis is finding intentional choices in materials that looked purely functional for decades. Sites are turning up with dates that push established timelines back by tens of thousands of years. Taken together, they point toward the same conclusion. The map of ancient human activity we've been working from was always a rough sketch drawn from incomplete data. That doesn't make ancient history mysterious. It makes it unfinished. The question isn't what secrets are buried out there. It's how much of what we've already decided turns out to be provisional. And the deeper archaeologists dig, the more that version of the past starts to look like a first draft. In 2020, a team of researchers began scanning a stretch of Greek landscape with an airborne laser system, and what they found underneath the vegetation rewrote the settlement history of an entire region. For most of the 20th century, the standard model of ancient settlement looked something like this: small clusters of population separated by long stretches of empty, uninhabited land, with meaningful civilizations concentrated around rivers, coastlines, and trade routes. The spaces in between were assumed to be exactly that: spaces, wilderness, gaps in the human story where nothing of particular importance was happening. And for a long time, the archaeological record seemed to support that picture, because the archaeological record was built almost entirely on what excavators could see from the ground. If you couldn't see a mound, a ruin, or a visible surface scatter of pottery, there was no obvious reason to start digging. The map of the ancient world was effectively a map of what had already been found, and what had already been found was almost always what was already visible. Here's the problem with that approach. A significant portion of what humans built, modified, and inhabited over thousands of years is now sitting under dense vegetation, eroded hillside, or a thin layer of accumulated soil that makes it completely invisible to the naked eye. Traditional survey methods required physical access, direct observation, and, frankly, a reasonable guess about where to look. Which means for generations, archaeologists were working from a map that had enormous blank sections. Not because nothing was there, but because the tools available simply couldn't see it. That distinction sounds minor until you start appreciating how much of the ancient world those blank sections might actually contain. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, works by firing millions of laser pulses from an aircraft toward the ground and measuring exactly how long each pulse takes to return. The software then strips away the returns that bounce off vegetation canopy and reconstructs only the returns that reach the actual terrain surface. What you're left with is a bare earth elevation model of extraordinary precision, detailed enough to reveal subtle rises, depressions, terracing, and linear features that would be completely undetectable from the ground. Think about that for a second. You can fly over a forested hillside and, within hours of processing, be looking at the outlines of walls, roads, and agricultural systems that no living person has physically seen in potentially thousands of years. The technology isn't magic, but the results have a way of feeling like it. In the Greek survey published in 2023, the research team covered a study area in Thessaly and identified over 200 previously unknown sites, ranging from prehistoric settlements to features dating as recently as the Byzantine period, collectively representing roughly 6,000 years of near-continuous human activity. What made this finding genuinely striking wasn't just the number, it was the density. These sites weren't scattered randomly across an otherwise empty landscape. They clustered, they connected, and in several cases they appeared to relate to each other spatially in ways that implied long-term, organized land use across generations. The region had been studied before. Archaeologists had worked there. Yet the visible record had suggested a relatively sparse and episodic occupation. The LiDAR data suggested something closer to the opposite. And this is where it gets uncomfortable for some of the older assumptions. If a well-studied area of Greece can hide more than 200 sites from ground-level survey, what does that suggest about regions that have received less systematic attention? The Amazon Basin LiDAR work, which began producing major results around 2018 and accelerated significantly through the early 2020s, revealed geometric earthworks, causeways, and large-scale forest modification across millions of square kilometers previously described as pristine wilderness. These weren't small settlements. Some of the identified complexes covered hundreds of kilometers and implied coordinated landscape management on a scale that the existing historical model simply hadn't accounted for. Mainstream interpretations had long treated the pre-Columbian Amazon as a sparsely populated environment with limited agricultural development. The LiDAR data does not make that reading easy to sustain. However, even if we accept that ancient populations were larger and more widely distributed than the traditional record suggested, important questions remain unresolved. Presence doesn't automatically mean connection, and connection doesn't automatically mean coordination. Finding 200 sites in a region tells you that people were there, and that they were there repeatedly, across a very long period of time. It does not tell you with certainty whether those communities were trading with each other, organized under shared political structures, or simply occupying the same favorable terrain independently across different eras. The difference between a densely settled landscape and an integrated civilization is a meaningful one. And LiDAR, for all its precision, cannot answer that question on its own. You still need excavation. You still need material culture, skeletal analysis, isotope work, and residue studies to understand what the social relationships between those sites actually looked like. What the technology has done, in a very direct way, is collapse the credibility of the argument from absence. For decades, if a region showed limited archaeological evidence of dense occupation, that limited evidence was treated as reasonably representative of what was actually there. LiDAR has now demonstrated, in multiple independent contexts across multiple continents, that the visible surface record can be radically, systematically incomplete. Not because archaeologists were careless, but because the ground was hiding things that no available method could detect. Every new survey that identifies hundreds of invisible sites in a previously studied area adds to the same basic conclusion. The ancient world was almost certainly more populated, more organized, and more spatially complex, and the evidence available before roughly 2010 allowed us to see. The landscape didn't change. Our ability to read it finally did, and that distinction matters more than it might seem. One of the firmest assumptions in the study of early human behavior has been that symbolic thinking, the ability to attach meaning to something beyond its physical use, was a relatively late development. For most of the 20th century, the accepted timeline placed this cognitive leap somewhere around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, a period archaeologists sometimes call the cognitive revolution. The evidence seemed to support it. Cave paintings, carved figurines, deliberate burial practices. These were the markers of a mind capable of abstraction, and they clustered tightly in the Upper Paleolithic record. The assumption was that before this point, early humans were operating in a fundamentally different cognitive register. Practical, reactive, focused entirely on survival in ways that left no room for meaning-making. Here's the problem. That assumption was built almost entirely on what survived, and what survived skewed heavily toward the durable. Stone lasts. Bone lasts under the right conditions. But the behaviors that precede symbolic thought, the preferences, the selections, the small decisions a mind makes when it reaches for one material over another, those don't preserve themselves cleanly in the archaeological record. So for a long time, the absence of evidence was treated as evidence of absence, which is a move that has a poor track record in this field. What's been turning that assumption over in the last 2 decades is a set of finds that don't fit the standard model and don't fit it in a very specific way. Researchers examining hand axes and stone tools from sites in Europe and Africa have found something that takes a moment to register. Some of these tools were made from materials that offered no obvious functional advantage. Not just flint or quartzite, the practical standards, but fossils embedded in rock, crystalline minerals, geodes, materials that were sometimes harder to work with, sometimes less effective as cutting implements, and almost certainly rarer and more difficult to source. At Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, hand axes have been identified that incorporate fossilized shells directly into their structure. The fossil wasn't ink, idental. The tool was shaped around it. At sites in the Iberian Peninsula and across the English Channel at Swanscombe, similar patterns appear with quartz crystals selected and worked into tools by hominins living hundreds of thousands of years before the cognitive revolution was supposed to have happened. Think about that for a second. If you're making a cutting tool and your only concern is function, you pick the material that gives you the sharpest edge with the least effort. That is the rational move. What you don't do is travel further to find a piece of rock that happens to contain a visible fossil, then carefully shape your tool to keep that fossil exposed and intact on the surface. That behavior requires something additional. It requires the fossil to matter for a reason that isn't purely mechanical. The reinterpretation this forces is genuinely uncomfortable for the standard model. If early hominins were selecting materials based on visual or tactile properties that served no cutting function, and the evidence increasingly suggests they were, then some form of preferential, non-utilitarian thinking was operating far earlier than the accepted timeline allows. We're not talking about abstract art. We're not talking about language. But we are talking about a mind that looked at 2 functionally equivalent stones and chose the one with the crystal running through it. Whether you call that symbolic thinking or proto-aesthetic preference or something else entirely, it doesn't map cleanly onto the image of a purely reactive early human brain. Some researchers have pushed this case quite directly. Francesco Derrico and April Nowell, among others, have argued that the cognitive revolution framework has always been too clean, too convenient, and too dependent on a European-centric reading of the archaeological record. The finds they point to suggest that behavioral modernity wasn't a switch that flipped 50,000 years ago. It was a much longer, more distributed process, with sparks of complex cognition appearing and possibly disappearing across different populations and time periods. The fossil-embedded hand axes aren't isolated anomalies. They form a pattern, and that pattern keeps extending further back the more carefully researchers look. However, even if we accept that these selections were intentional, The harder question is what intention actually meant to a hominin living 300,000 years ago. This is where the debate genuinely gets difficult, and where intellectual honesty requires slowing down. Selecting a visually striking material doesn't necessarily mean the individual understood why they preferred it. It doesn't require a symbolic framework. It might reflect something more like curiosity, a basic attraction to novelty or visual complexity that exists in many non-human animals and doesn't require anything approaching full symbolic cognition. The behavioral evidence and the cognitive inference are not the same thing, and conflating them is exactly the kind of move that makes these conversations harder than they need to be. What we can say with some confidence is that the traditional picture, a long plateau of cognitive simplicity, followed by a sudden explosion of symbolic behavior around 40,000 years ago, is no longer supportable as a complete account. The finds don't fit it. The distribution of unusual material choices across too many sites and too many time periods puts consistent pressure on the timeline in a way that can't be dismissed as coincidence or contamination. What we cannot say with confidence is what was happening inside the minds that made these choices. The tools themselves don't tell us what the people who made them were thinking, and that gap between object and intention is exactly where the debate lives. The stone tool record is extraordinarily detailed, spanning millions of years of human development. But it has always had one significant flaw as a source of evidence. Stone survives. Almost everything else doesn't. And for the better part of 2 centuries, that basic geological reality quietly shaped something much larger than a materials list. It shaped our entire mental image of what early humans were actually doing with their time. The assumption stated plainly was this: before roughly 300,000 years ago, the technological record is essentially a stone record, and that's because stone tools were what early humans primarily made. Wood, bone, plant fiber. These materials were acknowledged as possibilities, but they were treated as secondary, as supplements to the core lithic toolkit. The reasoning wasn't unreasonable. You work with the evidence you have. If every excavation across a dozen countries keeps turning up flint blades and hand axes and nothing else, the natural conclusion is that those were the dominant tools of the era. What didn't survive, it was assumed, probably wasn't there in significant quantities to begin with. That assumption started getting uncomfortable in 1994, when a lignite mine near Schöningen in northern Germany produced something nobody expected. Workers excavating the site uncovered a set of wooden throwing spears preserved in waterlogged sediment, dating to approximately 300,000 years ago. They were not crude sticks. They were shaped, balanced, and hardened at the tips, designed with a center of gravity that matched modern athletic javelins. Think about that for a second. The people who made those spears weren't experimenting blindly. They understood something sophisticated about the relationship between weight distribution and throwing mechanics. And they executed that understanding in a material that should have rotted away before our species even existed in its current form. For a while, Schöningen stood as an isolated anomaly. Remarkable, clearly, but perhaps a product of uniquely favorable preservation conditions. Then, in 2023, a site at Kalambo Falls in Zambia produced something that pushed the timeline back even further. Researchers working along a river gorge worked logs dating to at least 476,000 years ago, older than our own species, in terms of the conventional anatomical boundary for Homo sapiens. The logs showed deliberate cut marks and notches consistent with intentional shaping, and the positioning of the wood suggested a structure of some kind, possibly a platform or a raised surface. The oldest worked wood yet identified anywhere on Earth. At nearly 500,000 years old, it belongs to a period when mainstream archaeology had place. Early humans firmly in the category of stone tool users, foragers, and not much else beyond that. Here's the problem with sitting comfortably with the old framework. The Kalambo Falls site exists because of water, specifically because the waterlogged sediment along the river created the anaerobic conditions that prevented microbial decay. That's an extraordinarily specific set of circumstances. The terrifying part is how many sites didn't have those conditions. Every dry hillside excavation, every open-air site baked under 10,000 years of African sun, any wooden tools left in those places are simply gone, not absent from the archaeological record because they were never made, but absent because wood in normal soil conditions has a lifespan measured in decades, not centuries. What the Zambia find implies about cognitive capability is worth dwelling on. Working wood is not the same cognitive task as knapping flint. Stone fractures along predictable lines. A skilled knapper is essentially reading the internal geometry of a rock and exploiting it. Wood requires a different kind of knowledge entirely. An understanding of grain direction, moisture content, which species are suitable for which tasks, and how the material will behave as it dries. To work both materials with apparent competence suggests a mind that could hold multiple material systems simultaneously, categorize their different properties, and select between them based on intended use. That is not a simple cognitive profile. Mainstream interpretations of pre-modern Homo have sometimes struggled to accommodate it. The reinterpretation that follows from these finds is straightforward but significant. The stone tool record isn't a complete inventory of early human technology. It's a heavily filtered sample, biased toward whatever happened to mineralize or resist decay, which means every timeline we've built around the emergence of complex tool use, every developmental model that sequences cognitive milestones based on when certain tools first appear in the record, all of it is working from an incomplete data set in ways we probably haven't fully accounted for. What remains genuinely uncertain is harder to quantify. Whether wooden tool use at 476,000 years was widespread across early human populations or confined to specific groups in specific environments is something the current evidence can't resolve. The gap between one preserved site and a continental pattern is enormous. It's also unclear whether the behavior at Kalambo Falls developed independently of whatever was happening in Europe around the time of the Schoningen spears, or whether it points to a shared capacity that was distributed more broadly across the genus than our stone-dominated record implies. Both possibilities have different implications. One suggests a few isolated pockets of early sophistication. The other suggests we've been dramatically underestimating the baseline, which raises a question that's hard to answer cleanly. How much of what we think we know about early human capability is just a reflection of what happens to survive 200,000 years in the ground? For a long time, the story of human technological development moved in a fairly clean direction. Innovations appeared in certain regions and gradually spread outward as populations migrated and cultures made contact. Africa was the origin point. That much the fossil record seemed to confirm clearly enough. From there, the model described a relatively orderly diffusion, populations moving, carrying techniques with them, passing methods along through contact and migration until the innovations eventually reached the edges of the inhabited world. It was a tidy framework for most of the 20th century. The archaeological evidence seemed to support it well enough that questioning the basic shape of it felt almost unnecessary. The periphery regions, large stretches of Central and Eastern Asia in particular, were understood to be receivers of innovation, not originators of it. They were downstream from the places where the real technological leaps were happening. That assumption ran so deep into the structure of the field that excavations in those regions were sometimes approached with a different set of expectations before a single tool had been pulled from the ground. Here's the problem. The discoveries coming out of those supposedly peripheral regions over the last 2 decades don't fit that model cleanly at all. Sites across China and Southeast Asia have produced tool assemblages that show evidence of planning, deliberate shaping, what researchers describe as early composite construction, the combination of different materials to build a more functional object, at dates that are difficult to reconcile with the idea that these populations were simply receiving and adopting techniques developed elsewhere. Think about that for a second. If a region on the supposed receiving end of technological diffusion is producing independently complex tools at roughly the same time as the regions that were supposed to be the source, the entire directionality of the model becomes much harder to defend. What makes this genuinely complicated is that composite tool construction isn't a casual development. It requires understanding the properties of multiple materials simultaneously, anticipating how those materials will interact under stress, planning several steps ahead during the manufacturing process. That's not the behavior of a population passively adopting a technique handed to them from a distant contact group. That is independent problem solving. The archaeological record from these Asian sites is increasingly difficult to explain away as derivative. Some researchers now argue that sophisticated tool behavior may have emerged in multiple regions, more or less in parallel, driven by local environmental pressures rather than transmitted through a single cultural pipeline stretching back to one origin point. Does that mean the diffusion model is simply wrong? Not exactly. Migration and cultural contact were obviously real forces in the development of early technology. Dismissing them entirely would be its own kind of overcorrection. But the binary of origin regions versus peripheral receivers is looking more and more like a simplification that the evidence no longer supports. The terrifying part, if you follow this line of thinking, is that the model wasn't built on bad data. It was built on incomplete data. The regions that produced the most excavation, the most funding, the most academic attention over the last century were also the regions that happened to confirm the model those same academics were working from. Whether that represents a systematic bias or just the ordinary limits of where research was possible at a given historical moment is itself a matter of ongoing debate. Why would a population in a region presumed to be on the margins of early human innovation develop composite tools independently? That's a question mainstream archaeology is still working through. The honest answer right now is that we don't fully know. What the evidence suggests is that human beings, wherever they were living and whatever environmental pressures they were facing, appear to have been considerably more inventive than the standard diffusion model assumed. The cognitive capacity for sophisticated problem solving may not have been a trait that spread from one population outward. It may have been a baseline capability expressed differently depending on local conditions, available materials, and specific ecological demands, which changes the question considerably. Instead of asking where innovation began and how it traveled, researchers are increasingly asking why we assumed the geographic distribution of early ingenuity was ever that narrow to begin with. And this is where all four of the threads running through this video start to pull toward the same point. LiDAR reveals civilizations larger and more connected than the surface record suggested. Unusual tool materials push symbolic thinking back far earlier than the cognitive revolution timeline allowed. Wooden tools in Zambia expose how much early technology we've simply never seen because organic materials don't survive the way stone does. And now the regional innovation evidence suggests the entire directional model of how human ingenuity moved across the planet may need to be redrawn. None of these discoveries are minor corrections to an otherwise solid picture. Each one is pointing at a structural problem with the framework itself, the fact that the version of ancient history we've been working from was assembled from a fraction of the available evidence, weighted heavily toward what survived, what was excavated, what happened to confirm the expectations researchers already had going in. Every new technology that lets us see past that limitation, whether it's airborne lasers mapping buried landscapes or isotopic analysis revealing the origins of raw materials, doesn't just add data points to an existing map. It reveals that the map was always missing most of its territory. What we're still getting wrong about ancient history isn't any single fact. It's the assumption that the evidence we have now is anywhere close to complete.